Our team received a story from a viewer that honestly left us speechless. Picture this, a decorated military colonel's retirement ceremony filled with high-ranking officers, formal dress uniforms, and years of carefully built reputation, all about to crumble in the most unexpected way. Nicole Peterson stood alone in the back of that ballroom, deliberately seated in the furthest corner from the stage, while her own mother, Colonel Catherine Peterson, held court at the head table, surrounded by admirers. When Nicole walked past to get water, her mother's voice cut through the polite conversations, loud enough for everyone to hear. This party isn't for low-ranked nobodies who couldn't cut it. The humiliation was public calculated and designed to crush Nicole in front of dozens of witnesses. But then the main doors opened. A 4-star general walked in, her mother's superior officer, and his eyes landed on Nicole. What happened next made the entire room go silent. The general's reaction to seeing Nicole wasn't what anyone expected, especially not her mother, whose confident smile began to freeze on her face, because what Nicole's mother didn't know was that her daughter had been preparing for this exact moment for 2 years, gathering evidence, securing witnesses, and waiting for the one night when her mother would be most vulnerable. This is Nicole's story, and she's agreed to share exactly what happened that night in her own words. But I have to warn you, the revenge she delivered wasn't loud or violent. It was something far more devastating, the truth delivered at precisely the right moment in front of exactly the right people. By the end of that ceremony, Nicole's mother would understand that the daughter she dismissed as a low-ranked nobody had just dismantled 30 years of carefully constructed lies, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop it. My name is Nicole Peterson. I'm 33 years old, and I work as a civilian attorney specializing in military law, representing service members in cases the system would rather ignore. I used to be Captain Nicole Peterson JAG Corps until I learned that doing the right thing and keeping your career are sometimes mutually exclusive choices. Tonight, I was walking into my mother's retirement ceremony knowing exactly what kind of evening she had planned for me, and I was ready. The Officers Club looked exactly as I remembered from dozens of similar events over the years, polished wood panels, flags representing every branch of service, formal portraits of distinguished commanders lining the walls. I handed my printed invitation to the young corporal at the check-in desk. She scanned the barcode, then paused, her eyes flicking to the screen and back to me. She scanned it again. "Miss Peterson," she said carefully, "your seat assignment is Section C, Table 12. I didn't need to ask where that was. I'd attended enough military ceremonies to understand the geography of exclusion. Section A, the area directly in front of the stage with the best sightlines and acoustics, was reserved for VIPs, immediate family, and honored colleagues. Section B held the second tier of guests, people who mattered, but not quite enough for the premium positions. Section C was where you put people you had to invite but didn't actually want present, tucked behind structural columns, near the exit doors, far enough from the action that their presence became irrelevant. I walked into the main hall and immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. The room held perhaps 50 or 60 people, mostly active duty officers, in dress uniforms heavy with ribbons and medals, along with a scattering of retired veterans and military spouses in formal civilian attire. Conversations didn't exactly stop when I entered, but they stuttered, paused, resumed at lower volumes. Eyes tracked my movement across the room. No one approached to say hello. No one offered the casual greetings that normally flow freely at these gatherings. I was being observed, assessed, and found wanting all within the first 30 seconds. I kept my expression neutral and my posture confident as I navigated between tables toward my assigned seat. From this distance, I could see my mother, Colonel Catherine Peterson, seated at the head table in Section A. She was surrounded by senior officers holding court in that effortless way she'd perfected over 3 decades of military service. Her dress uniform was immaculate, her silver hair styled in regulation fashion, her posture radiating the kind of authority that made junior officers instinctively straighten their spines when she entered a room. Table 12 was positioned exactly as I'd expected, behind a thick structural column that blocked most of the view toward the stage. From here I could see my mother clearly when I leaned slightly to the left, but anyone on stage would have difficulty even noticing I existed. The message was unmistakable and probably intentional. I sat down, placed my small clutch on the empty table, and began my own careful observation of the room. About 20 minutes into the pre-ceremony reception, I stood to get water from the refreshment table positioned near the bar. The route required walking past Section A, past my mother's table, and her circle of admirers. I kept my pace steady, my expression pleasant and neutral. That's when her voice cut through the ambient conversation with perfect timing and projection. This party isn't for low-rank nobodies who couldn't cut it. She didn't turn her head toward me. She didn't make eye contact. But the timing was so precise, the volume so carefully calibrated to carry to nearby tables, while maintaining plausible deniability that everyone within 20 feet understood exactly who she meant. 3 retired colonels seated at her table nodded in agreement, their expression suggesting they'd heard this narrative before. One of them, a man I vaguely recognized from past events, added in a voice just loud enough to be heard. Heard she left under a cloud, some kind of dispute with command decisions. I reached the refreshment table, poured water into a glass with a hand that didn't shake, and walked back to my seat. I didn't respond. I didn't react visibly, but I was taking inventory. I noted which officers looked away when I passed, which ones nodded along with my mother's characterization, which few seemed uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty, born from family tension. This was orchestrated. My mother had prepared these people, seeded these narratives, constructed a consensus about who I was and what I represented before I even arrived. As I sat back down at table 12, I noticed details I'd missed during my initial survey of the room. A young officer from the Public Affairs Office, identifiable by his badge and equipment, was setting up a professional video camera on a tripod, positioned to capture the stage and the front section of the audience. This wasn't someone's personal phone recording, this was official military documentation. Every word spoken here tonight, every reaction captured on camera, would become part of the permanent record. Any emotional outburst from me, any angry confrontation with my mother would be preserved and available to circulate through military channels as proof of whatever story she wanted to tell. I looked more carefully at the guest composition. 2 men in expensive civilian business suits sat at my mother's table, notable because everyone else wore either military uniform or formal evening wear, appropriate to military spouses. They could be journalists, public relations consultants, or both brought in to help manage the narrative of Colonel Catherine Peterson's distinguished retirement. Colonel James Morrison. My mother's longtime protege and one of her most vocal supporters moved through the crowd with the ease of someone coordinating an event. I watched him check the microphone system at the podium, speak briefly with the catering staff, ensure the photographers had clear angles. The guest list itself told a story. Every person in this room held at least the rank of major or its equivalent. Every civilian present was connected to senior leadership. Conspicuously absent were any junior enlisted personnel, any of the younger service members who might have remembered my work in JAG Corps or understood what I'd tried to do. My mother hadn't just excluded me from the family table. She'd constructed an entire environment designed to validate a single narrative, the decorated colonel who devoted her life to service versus the daughter who couldn't handle the pressure and quit. I pulled out my phone and saw a new email, just one line. Statement ready. Will attend as planned. Sergeant Torres. I typed back quickly, stay low profile until I signal. I had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, but everything depended on timing and sequence. Rush it, and my mother's defensive structures would activate. Wait too long and the ceremony would conclude with her reputation intact and my credibility destroyed. The main entrance doors at the back of the hall swung open with enough force to draw attention. A figure in dress uniform entered, and I could see even from this distance that his uniform jacket carried the weight of significant commendation ribbons and service medals. Several officers near the door came to attention, reflexively responding to whatever rank insignia they'd spotted. But as I watched the man's face scan the room, looking for someone specific, I knew this wasn't the arrival of someone who would solve my problems or validate my position. This was just the next move in a very complicated game, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. The figure approaching through the center aisle resolved into someone I recognized from photographs and military publications, Brigadier General James Mitchell, Inspector General's office. The room responded to his presence with the reflexive discipline ingrained in military culture. Officers straightened in their seats. Conversations dropped to respectful murmurs. Several people near the entrance came to attention, until he waved them at ease with a practiced gesture. He walked directly toward the head table where my mother sat, and she rose to meet him, with the kind of smile reserved for superior officers, whose good opinion matters. They exchanged salutes with textbook precision. Colonel Peterson, the general said, his voice carrying the formal warmth appropriate to the occasion. Congratulations on your retirement. My mother's response was equally polished. Thank you, sir. We're honored to have you here. The exchange lasted perhaps 10 seconds, the kind of brief acknowledgement that senior officers make at ceremonial events. Then, General Mitchell's gaze swept the room and landed on me in Section C. I felt the moment his eyes focused, recognizing something or someone. My body responded before my conscious mind engaged straightening in my seat, shoulders back posture military, despite the civilian dress I wore. The general's expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted in his eyes. He nodded once in my direction. Ms. Peterson. 2 words, not Captain Peterson, which would have acknowledged my former rank. I'd resigned my commission, left active duty, and military protocol dictated the civilian honorific. But the tone carried something I hadn't expected, a measure of professional respect that several people near enough to hear clearly noticed. I saw my mother's smile tighten at the corners of micro-expression that disappeared almost before it registered. What my mother didn't know, what most people in this room didn't know, was why General Mitchell was actually here. The Inspector General's office doesn't send brigadier generals to retirement ceremonies as a courtesy. They conduct audits of retiring senior officers' records, particularly when certain flags appear in the system during routine reviews. I knew he was here on official business because I'd been the one who triggered those flags 2 years ago when I filed formal complaints before resigning. Mitchell had no idea about tonight's family drama. From his perspective, this was a professional obligation, nothing more. But that neutrality made him more dangerous to me than outright hostility would have been, because my mother still had the opportunity to shape his perception before he learned the full story. Catherine recovered instantly from whatever momentary discomfort the general's acknowledgement of me had caused. She gestured toward the empty seat beside her at the head table, her smile warm and welcoming. General, we're truly honored to have you witness how real leadership shapes careers and units over decades of service. She paused just long enough for the words to register, then added with careful emphasis, not all paths lead to the same honor, of course. Some of us stayed the course. The phrasing sounded generic enough, the kind of inspirational military rhetoric that fills ceremony speeches. But everyone raised in military culture understood the subtext immediately. She was talking about someone who quit someone who abandoned their duty when things got difficult. Several heads turned slightly in my direction, putting the pieces together. My mother continued her voice, carrying that particular warmth that somehow makes criticism sound like disappointed love. I'm sure Ms. Peterson understands that tonight celebrates those who served with integrity through difficult decisions. The word integrity hit like a physical blow. In military culture, integrity isn't just a virtue, it's the foundation of everything. To suggest someone lacks integrity, even indirectly, is to question their fundamental fitness for service. Colonel Morrison materialized beside the general as though choreographed, which it probably was. General Mitchell, he said, voice pitched perfectly to sound respectful and informative. Colonel Peterson's leadership during some truly challenging periods has been exemplary. She always put mission first, even when facing complex situations that could have derailed unit cohesion. On the surface, it was pure compliment. But Morrison had just accomplished something subtle and devastating. He'd confirmed to General Mitchell that there had been challenging periods and complex situations, military code for scandal controversy, or failure. He'd planted the idea that my mother had navigated some kind of crisis that threatened unit effectiveness, and he'd done it while maintaining complete plausibility, giving Mitchell just enough information to create questions without providing any facts that could be challenged. General Mitchell's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then nodded apologetically to my mother. Colonel, please excuse me. I need to take this call. And he addressed the room as he moved toward the exit. Colonel Peterson will continue this conversation shortly. Ms. Peterson, good to see you. Then he was gone, and the carefully maintained civility dissolved the moment the door closed behind him. My mother leaned toward Morrison, her lips barely moving as she whispered something I couldn't hear from my position. Morrison nodded once, then began moving through the crowd with apparent casualness, but I could track his progress by the reactions he left in his wake. At one table, heads leaned together after he passed, glancing toward Section C. At another, a colonel's wife whispered something to her husband, her expression concerned. I caught fragments of what Morrison was saying as he worked the room. No longer active duty, career didn't work out. Some kind of disagreement with command decisions. A woman approached my table, and I recognized her as Major Susan Brennan, retired someone who'd served under my mother's command years ago. Her smile was pleasant, her tone friendly. Nicole, it's been so long. So what do you do now, dear? The question sounded innocent, even caring, but I saw the trap immediately. If I said civilian attorney, everyone would assume I'd left the military because I couldn't succeed within it, couldn't handle the pressure had washed out. If I mentioned military law specifically, my mother would find a way to twist it into evidence of bitterness or obsession. I kept my voice level and professional. I prosecute war crimes and defend victims of military abuse." The words created an immediate ripple effect. Conversations near my table stuttered and stopped. Several people turned to look at me directly. I'd essentially declared what side I was on, what I believed in, and by implication what I thought of people who prioritized institutional reputation over individual justice. My mother's voice cut through the sudden quiet, still warm, still pleasant, but carrying a new edge that everyone could hear. "How noble, Nicole, truly." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, just long enough to drain them of sincerity. "Though I recall your last case in JAG. Didn't quite work out as planned, did it?" The statement landed like a grenade. She'd just told everyone in the room that my career had ended in failure, that whatever high-minded principles I claimed to fight for now were possibly compensation for professional inadequacy. And she'd done it as a question maintaining plausible deniability while planting doubt about my competence and credibility. I saw General Mitchell re-entering through the main doors, his phone call apparently concluded. My mother had just made a very specific claim about my service record, and she'd made it publicly in front of a general from the Inspector General's office. She'd opened a door she wouldn't be able to close. I didn't respond to my mother's pointed comment about my JAG career. Instead, I raised my voice slightly, just enough to carry across the intervening tables, and directed my attention to Colonel Morrison, who was standing near the bar. My tone was professionally curious, the kind you'd use to clarify a detail during a briefing. "Colonel Morrison, when you mentioned challenging periods a few moments ago, were you referring to the unit integrity review in 2022? Morrison's hand, which had been reaching for a glass, froze midair. His eyes flicked immediately toward my mother, seeking guidance on how to respond. The question wasn't aggressive. I hadn't made an accusation. I'd simply asked for clarification about something he'd voluntarily mentioned. But the specificity of the date and the formal terminology made it clear I wasn't speaking from vague memory or secondhand information. My mother's voice cut in before Morrison could formulate an answer smooth and dismissive. "That was an internal matter, Nicole. Resolved through appropriate channels years ago." She turned slightly toward General Mitchell, including him in her response, as if to demonstrate transparency. Just routine command issues that every unit faces. I nodded slowly, as though she'd provided helpful information rather than attempted to shut down the conversation. "Of course, I understand. I'm just trying to ensure timeline details are accurate. General Mitchell's office conducts routine audits of retiring officers' records, and having precise information helps those reviews proceed efficiently. By framing my question as assistance with an official process, rather than a personal challenge, I'd made it much harder for my mother to refuse engagement without appearing defensive or obstructive. Morrison apparently deciding he needed to support Catherine's dismissal of the topic stepped forward. The review was conducted entirely by the book Ms. Peterson. Standard procedures were followed throughout. No substantiated misconduct was found. His voice carried the confidence of someone stating established facts. I maintained the same neutral, helpful tone. "That's very helpful context, Colonel. Just to clarify, the process were the 3 original complainants interviewed as part of that resolution." The question was specific enough that Morrison couldn't deflect with vague generalities about procedure, but broad enough that I wasn't revealing exactly what documentation I possessed or what I knew about how the case had actually been handled. Morrison opened his mouth, then closed it again. His hesitation lasted only 2 seconds, but in a room full of military officers trained to notice such things, 2 seconds of uncertainty spoke volumes. My mother recognized what I was doing. I could see it in the way her posture changed, the way her eyes sharpened with calculation. She was realizing that I wasn't here to make emotional accusations or create a family scene. I was building something methodical, question by question, using their own words to construct a record. She stood, and the movement immediately commanded attention. 30 years of authority radiated from her stance. "Since you're so concerned with records and reviews, Nicole, perhaps you should address your record." Her voice carried across the entire room, now ensuring every guest could hear. "Why you resigned from JAG Corps in the middle of that very case you're now questioning so publicly. Why you chose to leave rather than see it through to its conclusion." The accusation landed with devastating effectiveness. In military culture, there are few insults more damaging than being called a quitter. Someone who abandons their post under pressure, who walks away when things get difficult, violates one of the fundamental codes that holds the entire structure together. My mother continued, and I heard genuine-sounding disappointment color her voice, perfectly pitched for the audience. "Some people talk about integrity and justice. Others demonstrate those values by remaining in difficult situations, by making hard choices, by staying when it would be easier to leave." She paused, letting the implicit comparison sink in. "You left, Nicole. You walked away. And now you want to question those of us who stayed." Colonel Morrison, reading his cue perfectly, added his own contribution. I believe there was a fitness review involved, something regarding inability to handle command pressure. He phrased it as a tentative recollection, a question rather than a statement, giving himself legal cover while planting the seed of doubt. The implication was clear. I'd been evaluated, found wanting, and pushed out, rather than choosing to leave on my own terms. I watched several guests shift in their seats, their expressions changing from neutral observation to skepticism. The narrative was pivoting dangerously. My mother was successfully recasting me as a failed officer, seeking revenge through bureaucratic harassment, making anything I said now appear motivated by bitterness rather than legitimate concern. Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't sound defensive, a different voice cut through the tension. Catherine, I remember this case. Mrs. Helen Carter stood from her seat in Section B, and despite her age, she had to be in her late 70s. Her voice carried clearly. She was the widow of Brigadier General Robert Carter, a man whose reputation for integrity had been legendary in certain circles. My late husband mentioned it to me. He said the young JAG officer involved that was you, wasn't it? Nicole showed remarkable courage in pursuing justice despite facing significant pressure from multiple directions. The intervention created a visible crack in my mother's carefully constructed narrative. Several officers who had been nodding along with Catherine's characterization now looked uncertain, caught between competing authorities. But my mother recovered with impressive speed, her tone shifting to respectful warmth directed at Mrs. Carter. Helen, we all appreciate courage. No one disputes that. The question is whether courage is properly applied within the chain of command, within the established systems we've built, or whether it's used to undermine military order and unit cohesion. She'd managed to acknowledge Mrs. Carter's point while simultaneously reinforcing her own argument that I'd been insubordinate, that my actions had damaged rather than served military justice. While my mother continued engaging Mrs. Carter and several other guests in an explanation about balancing individual conscience with institutional needs, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. A woman in civilian clothes, seated several tables away in Section B, stood and began walking toward the restrooms. She didn't look in my direction, but I recognized her instantly. Staff Sergeant Maria Torres, late 30s, retired from active duty 2 years ago. My phone vibrated against my leg. I pulled it out enough to see the screen under the table. One line of text, "Ready when you are." I looked back toward the head table. My mother was in full command mode now, gesturing expressively as she explained to Mrs. Carter and a small cluster of listeners why military effectiveness required difficult decisions that civilians might not fully understand. She was confident, again secure in her control of the room's perception. She had no idea that the foundation she was standing on had already begun to crack, that the careful structure of lies and half-truths she'd spent years building was about to face a kind of scrutiny she couldn't deflect or spin. I stood slowly, my movement deliberate enough to draw attention without appearing aggressive. My voice, when I spoke, was calm, professional, and loud enough to carry. Colonel Peterson, I have one question, a simple factual question for the record. My mother didn't give me the opportunity to ask my question. She stood from the head table with the kind of decisive movement that instantly commands attention, the physical embodiment of 3 decades of authority. Every conversation in the room ceased. Every eye turned toward her. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying the weight of someone about to perform an unpleasant but necessary duty. Before we proceed with this evening's ceremony, I need to address something directly. She paused, surveying the room to ensure she had complete attention. My daughter Nicole is here tonight. She's been asking questions, bringing up old cases, making implications about command decisions that were made years ago. The way she phrased it made me sound like someone dredging up ancient history for unclear motives, someone unable to let go. I want to be completely transparent about what actually happened. My mother continued, and I recognized the rhetorical strategy immediately. By claiming transparency, she was positioning herself as the honest party while implicitly casting me as deceptive. Nicole resigned from JAG Corps because she fundamentally disagreed with how military justice was being administered. She wanted to pursue court-martial charges against 3 NCOs based on complaints that, while serious, could not be substantiated under the standards of evidence required by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The framing was surgical. She wasn't saying I was wrong to investigate, or that the complaints were false. She was saying I wanted to destroy the careers of 3 service members without meeting the burden of proof, painting me as someone willing to ruin lives based on insufficient evidence. Several heads nodded around the room. The logic seemed sound if you didn't know what had actually happened, if you didn't know that the evidence had been substantial and that the case had been closed before the investigation was complete. My mother's voice took on a tone of disappointed understanding, the sound of someone trying to be fair to a person who had let them down. When the decision was made to resolve the matter administratively in the interest of maintaining unit cohesion during a critical operational period, Nicole chose to resign rather than accept that military leadership sometimes requires difficult choices that balance multiple priorities. She let that sink in before delivering her conclusion. She prioritized being right over doing what was right for the mission and the people under our command. Colonel Morrison rose from his seat as if on cue, though I suspected no actual signal had passed between them. They'd simply worked together long enough to know how to support each other's narratives. Colonel Peterson handled an impossible situation with exceptional wisdom and discretion, he said, his voice carrying across the room. The unit remained fully mission ready. Morale stayed strong. That's the definition of effective leadership under pressure. The silence that followed was physically oppressive. I stood alone at table 12, and I could feel the weight of judgment settling onto me from every direction. No one spoke in my defense. Mrs. Carter, who had stood up for me just minutes ago, remained in her seat, her expression troubled but her mouth closed. I understood why. My mother had just made accusations about military justice procedures, about evidence standards, about command decisions during operational deployments. These were technical military matters, and Mrs. Carter, despite her late husband's distinguished service, was a civilian widow with no standing to judge such things. Her earlier support had been based on her husband's general impression of my character. This was about specific legal and procedural questions that were beyond her expertise. I watched several guests who had been seated at nearby tables quietly stand and move to seats farther away, creating physical distance between themselves and me. The message was unmistakable. Association with me had become socially toxic. My mother's narrative had achieved complete dominance. To everyone in this room, I now appeared as someone who couldn't handle the complexity of real-world command decisions, who had quit when things didn't go exactly as I wanted, and who was now returning years later to disrupt my mother's well-earned retirement celebration out of bitterness and spite. The public affairs officer's camera continued recording every moment, preserving this version of events for official posterity. Catherine stood surrounded by supporters at the head table, perfectly positioned to conclude her remarks, and transitioned smoothly into the formal retirement ceremony. She had successfully neutralized my presence, protected her reputation, and was ready to receive her honors. But she made one additional statement, perhaps driven by overconfidence in her victory, perhaps by genuine conviction in the righteousness of her actions. "I want to be absolutely clear," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. "I made the command decision to recommend administrative resolution of that case. It was my duty as commanding officer to balance accountability with unit welfare. That decision was mine. I stand by it completely. And if I faced the same situation today, I would make exactly the same choice." Something shifted in the room's atmosphere, though I doubted anyone else noticed it. By publicly claiming sole personal responsibility for the decision to close the case administratively, my mother had just created an official statement about her specific role in a military justice matter. She'd committed herself to a factual claim that she had made a command decision after a proper investigation had concluded and evidence had been properly evaluated. But that wasn't what had actually happened, and I had documentation proving it. The main entrance doors opened. General Mitchell walked back into the room, and his entire demeanor had changed. The professional courtesy and neutral pleasantness from earlier had been replaced by something much more focused and serious. He moved directly toward the front of the room with purpose, and the crowd parted instinctively. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, and his voice carried formal authority that silenced even the whispers that had started. "However, I have just been informed of a matter that requires immediate clarification. Colonel Peterson, Ms. Peterson, both of you will need to remain after this gathering concludes for a formal discussion." The room went absolutely still. I watched color drain from my mother's face. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Colonel Morrison's expression shifted from confident support to confused concern. I felt my shoulders relax for the first time all evening, my posture loosening as tension I'd been carrying for hours began to release. Movement caught my attention in Section B. A woman in civilian clothes stood from her seat and began walking toward the front of the room with steady, deliberate steps. Staff Sergeant Maria Torres had been waiting all night for this exact moment, and now she was ready to speak. General Mitchell's voice carried formal authority as he addressed the room. "I've been made aware of a formal statement relevant to tonight's discussion. The timing is unusual, but given the public statements just made, clarity is necessary now." Maria Torres reached the front of the room, and despite her civilian clothes, her bearing was unmistakably military. She stood with her shoulders back, hands at her sides, facing General Mitchell directly. "Sir, I'm Staff Sergeant Maria Torres, retired. In April 2022, I was one of 3 personnel who filed formal complaints regarding sexual harassment by NCOs in the 23rd Support Battalion commanded by Colonel Peterson." The atmosphere in the room sharpened instantly, every officer present understanding the significance of what Torres had just identified herself as. Captain Nicole Peterson was assigned as our JAG prosecutor. She interviewed each of us separately, collected physical evidence, reviewed communication records, and built what she described to us as a prosecutable case. In June 2022, we were informed the case would be resolved administratively. The 3 accused were transferred to different units. We were told this resolution was in our best interest and that pursuing court-martial would be traumatic for us. Torres paused, her voice remaining steady but gaining force. No one asked whether we agreed with that assessment. We were given no voice in the decision about our own case. The message we received was unmistakable: speaking up changes nothing. The system protects itself. My mother tried to interrupt, her voice sharp. "Sergeant, that resolution was determined after proper consultation with multiple levels of command structure." But Torres continued, speaking over her with respectful firmness. "Ma'am, with respect, you sent an email to JAG Command recommending administrative resolution before Captain Peterson had completed her investigation." I know this because Captain Peterson showed me that email when she explained she was forwarding it to Inspector General as evidence of unlawful command influence. General Mitchell turned toward me. "Ms. Peterson, do you have documentation of this communication?" I pulled out my phone already open to the relevant email thread I'd preserved for 2 years. "Sir, I have the complete correspondence from April through June 2022. On April 28th, Colonel Peterson sent an email to JAG Command stating, 'Recommend administrative resolution to preserve unit cohesion and avoid negative publicity during operational tempo increase.' This was sent while my investigation was still active and before I had submitted any findings or recommendations. I scrolled down. I also have sworn statements from Sergeant Torres and one other complainant and documentation showing that one of the transferred NCOs was involved in a similar incident at his new assignment in 2023. My voice remained factual, clinical even. When I reported the command influence to Inspector General, I was counseled that my approach was inflexible and that I was damaging relationships with senior leadership. I resigned 3 months later. My mother stood, her posture, rigid, voice controlled but strained. I made a command decision based on my assessment of what was best for unit welfare. That falls within my authority as a commanding officer. General Mitchell's response was measured but unambiguous. Colonel, your authority does not extend to directing the outcome of JAG investigations before they reach completion. That constitutes unlawful command influence regardless of your intent or the outcome you were trying to achieve. Torres spoke again, her words deliberate. Ma'am, you called Captain Peterson into your office 3 separate times during the investigation period. You told her that career-minded officers understand when to show flexibility. Those aren't the words of a commander respecting the independence of military justice. My mother didn't apologize. She didn't break down or show emotion. She simply repeated, voice hard. I prioritized my unit's mission readiness. Every decision I made served that objective. But the room had transformed. 3 senior officers stood and walked toward the exit without explanation. Mrs. Carter approached me, squeezed my hand briefly, and whispered, "Your father would be proud," before leaving quietly. The public affairs officer began packing his camera equipment. There would be no ceremonial video to commemorate this evening. General Mitchell addressed the remaining guests. Inspector General's office will conduct a comprehensive review of Colonel Peterson's 2022 command decisions. This gathering is concluded. People dispersed in uncomfortable silence, some offering brief farewells to my mother, most simply leaving. The retirement ceremony, that was supposed to celebrate her distinguished career, never happened. A week later, I received 3 emails that changed everything. JAG Corps invited me to join a panel on military justice reform. Inspector General's office requested my consultation on whistleblower cases, and 2 more service members came forward with their own stories about my mother's command. Meanwhile, Catherine's retirement was processed as routine separation, not with honors. Her former supporters stopped returning her calls. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, but certain. The truth mattered. Systems can work when people refuse to stay silent. Sometimes standing up costs everything in the moment, but staying silent costs your soul forever. If you've ever had to choose between what's right and what's easy, or if you've watched someone in power abuse that position, share your story in the comments below. Have you ever had to speak truth to authority? What happened? And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to our channel. We share real stories about courage, justice, and standing up when it matters most. Your story might be the one that helps someone else find their voice.